In the immortal words of William Shakespeare,
For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother.
soldiers who have been through combat speak of a camaraderie, a closeness shared with their brothers in arms that surpasses any bond of friendship experienced by those of us in the civilian world, those who haven't weathered the storms of war. The experience of facing down incoming gunfire and artillery, knowing that you would give your life for the man next to you, and that he would readily do the same, produces an intimacy that defies understanding. It is its focus on that powerful bond that makes Band of Brothers a timeless classic that so many of its viewers return to year after year, to be reminded of the heights of bravery, perseverance, and self-sacrificial love to which men can and have ascended. While that central theme forms the heart of the show, that is its most crucial aspect that does the most work to endear it to its audience, Band of Brothers' writing, acting, cinematography, and set and costume design are also all excellent. Let's start with writing, which is comprised of three main facets: dialogue, characters, and pacing. I won't say too much about the first and last elements of that list, because not much needs to be said. The dialogue in Band of Brothers feels natural, smoothly introducing the viewer to the world of Easy Company without straying into clunky exposition. No one has to tell us that Captain Sobel is a hard-ass. He makes it abundantly clear in one of the opening scenes of the show.
That may be good enough for the rest of the 506, but that is not good enough for Easy Company.
If other characters do talk about Sobel, it's typically to complain about his tactics that we've already witnessed, and their conversations give us insight into how his leadership style is received by his men.
He gets jumpy and then you get killed.
The show does not waste dialogue. No lines are spoken without purpose or meaning. Every word a character says has weight behind it. The series never feels the need to fill dead air with extraneous dialogue. If the audience is left in silence for a time, there is a reason. Band of Brothers doesn't rush from one plot point or scene to the next, striving to keep the viewer engaged with constant change. Rather, it has a measured, methodical pace that allows the story and characters to unfold without being hurried or drawn out. While a viewer might initially be anxious for the men of Easy Company to get into the action, this is a series about World War II after all, one quickly discovers that the moments in between firefights are some of the most precious. When the excitement brings with it the very real possibility of injury and death for beloved characters, we find ourselves appreciating the times of rest and peace all the more.
Enjoy it while it lasts. We'll be moving out soon.
Out of town, Lieutenant? Already?
One of the complaints you could levy against Band of Brothers is that there are a lot of characters, and they're wearing helmets most of the time, so it's hard to keep track of who is who. And while that may be a legitimate complaint, it really doesn't diminish the excellent character work done by the show. Obviously, the series couldn't introduce us to every single member of Easy Company, which was comprised of 140 men and 7 officers at the beginning of the war, not to mention the replacements for casualties, but Band of Brothers does establish more than a few of the paratroopers' character traits and attitudes in a relatively short amount of time. 10 hours is too short a time to spend with such admirable young men, but Band of Brothers makes use of every moment. That main cast spans a wide variety of backgrounds and contains a mix of temperaments that helps distinguish them from one another. Each paratrooper has a distinct personality that the viewer can identify, even if one doesn't at first know the soldier's name. Naturally, though, these personalities are not totally static. The war changes these young men, sometimes in drastic and tragic ways. And even those who don't necessarily suffer from such awful changes cannot escape the effects of combat, the loss of their closest friends, and eventually the dramatic shift away from fighting and into their new role as an occupation force. The character work is less subtle and nuanced than you might find in modern dramas, but the reality of war was also far less nuanced than our most modern-day situations in which protagonists find themselves. The horrors of battle force the men of Easy Company to change in obvious yet powerful ways, from their perspectives on the Germans they fight to their feelings for their fellow soldiers. The most prominent instance of this is after the Battle of the Bulge, during which the paratroopers spent well over a month living in foxholes in the Ardennes forest, weathering German attacks and fierce artillery fire. After Bastogne, a paratrooper who was wounded in Holland rejoins Easy Company, having missed the horrible freezing combat, and his upbeat attitude and fresh uniform stand in stark contrast to the downcast scowls and discolored uniforms of his comrades, who have suffered through horrors beyond his reckoning.
Yeah?
Yeah, Bill got hit. Blew his whole leg off.
This is a rather simple yet effective example of how costume design can tell a story. One look at Private Webster standing next to a fellow soldier who had been through the defense of Bastogne is enough to tell the viewer a great deal about how much, or how little, these men have had to endure, respectively, over the past months. I don't have a lot more to add about costumes. They are what they need to be, fitting neatly into each scene without any one outfit standing out, as you would imagine is appropriate in the Army. I will briefly touch on sets, just to say that they are similar to costumes in that they fill their role exactly as they should, being an essentially yet largely unremarkable part of the story. That being said, the plain yet crucial town of Carentan, the frozen and shell-shocked woods around Bastogne, and the opulence of Berchtesgaden and the Eagle's Nest will forever be imprinted upon my mind. Why is that? Everything I've described so far is an argument for why Band of Brothers is a good show, a quality production that was made by talented writers, actors, and directors, but nothing that is exactly outstanding. Part of what makes the series truly excellent is its cinematography, an art form that is important in any film, but especially so in a war story, where the audience needs to be informed by what they see, but also should be given a sense of the confusion and chaos that is present in combat. Band of Brothers absolutely nails its cinematography. The camera work during battles perfectly balances shots of the action, paratroopers firing, artillery exploding, German troops maneuvering, with close-ups of the men of Easy Company as they react to the combat unfurling around them. The audience isn't fed too much information. We are largely put into the boots of the American soldiers, who themselves have a limited view of each firefight, enabling us to see the war through their eyes from their limited perspective. However, that doesn't stop the visuals from being absolutely beautiful, stunning, and poetic, as well as gripping, haunting, and heartbreaking. I could use any number of examples to emphasize this point, but arguably the most impactful shot occurs at the end of the first episode, as the invasion fleet, made up of thousands upon thousands of ships and aircraft, departs across the English Channel. Even in all that grandeur, the show doesn't forget what it's about. As we watch this incredible mechanized armada, we see Winters doing the same thing. We are put in his shoes as he witnesses the vast undertaking of which he is now a part. That is a large part of what makes Band of Brothers so special and timeless. It is not merely a well-done show, even an excellent show, but it is a piece of art crafted with extreme dedication and care about one of the most pivotal and defining events of the 20th century. And furthermore, it explored the effects that fighting that war had on the bodies, minds, hearts, and souls of the young men tasked with defending the free world from tyranny.
We're all scared. You hid in that ditch because you think there's still hope. The only hope you have is to accept the fact that you're already dead.
On its own, that is probably enough to make us care. Tales of brave soldiers with noble missions easily win their way into our hearts as we watch in awe at their courage, persistence, strength of will, and dedication to their righteous cause. This series certainly has all that, but it has so much more. Band of Brothers does not just show us men fighting a war on the side of good, it tells the story of each man fighting for the good of the man next to him. From the very beginning of their training in Toccoa, Georgia, the men of Easy Company display a growing bond as they endure the harsh training imposed by Captain Sobel.
Orders change! Get up! Lectures are canceled! Easy Company is running up Curry! Move!
We soon learn that these are not ordinary men. They did not wait to be drafted into service, but instead volunteered for the airborne. They freely chose to jump out of perfectly good airplanes for their country, and thus opted to go through the toughest training the Army had to offer, so that when they entered combat, the man next to them would be the best.
Once we get into combat, the only person you can trust is yourself and the fella next to you.
Long as he's a paratrooper.
These soldiers did not hide from the inevitability of combat that awaited them an ocean away. They jumped wholeheartedly toward their fate, acknowledging that they would have to join the battle one way or the other. In doing so, the men of Easy Company teach us an important lesson about control, influence, and acceptance. There are very few things in life that we can truly control, a few more that we can influence, and a whole host of things that we can do nothing about and simply have to accept and react to. These paratroopers could not stop the US from entering the war, and they most likely could not stop themselves from getting drafted. Rather than let those outside events dictate their entire future, these young men chose to exert what control and influence they could, forging their own paths into combat. They recognized that their lives were changed unalterably by events far beyond their control, but they chose not to wallow in despair or to trust to some vague hope that they would dodge the war entirely.
You know why they volunteered? So when things got really bad, the man in the foxhole next to them would be the best, not some draftee who's gonna get him killed.
We should pray to have such fortitude as the men of Easy Company, to have the bravery to face our circumstances, however dire, to acknowledge what we can and cannot control, and then choose to exert what influence we can for our own good and for the good of those we love. This cadre of paratroopers demonstrated that courage from the very beginning, from their simple act of raising their hands when the call for volunteers for the airborne went out. But the real test of their fortitude would arrive a year and a half later, when they experienced the chaotic and deadly drop into Normandy in the early hours of D-Day, and their bravery would continue to be tested throughout the European campaign, from France to Holland to Belgium and Germany. From June of 1944 to May of 1945, aside from a brief interlude between the Normandy landing and Operation Market Garden, Easy Company was at war, on the front lines, often at a critical position for the Allied advance.
Why is Easy Company the only company at the front of an advance or exposed at the far edge of the line?
The fact that any of those men made it through intact in body and mind is simply remarkable. However, it's not just that they were present for all that combat, from the assault on Brecourt Manor on D-Day to the defense of Bastogne the following Christmas. It's that the men of Easy Company wanted to be there. When Popeye Wynne got hit on the rear on D-Day, he remarks,
I just got here.
and then later goes AWOL from an army hospital in England in order to join the company on their jump into Holland, even though the man still couldn't sit down.
Can you make the jump?
Sure, I can't live. I just can't sit.
I highlight that story to emphasize a crucial point. These paratroopers did not want to be in combat because they loved the thrill or the killing, but because that is where their brothers were. They knew that the men they had trained with, fought with, the men who would die and kill for them, were going into battle, and each man could not suffer the thought of letting his brothers weather enemy fire without him at their side. That is why the most haunting episodes and moments of Band of Brothers are not just when the audience sees the death of one or more paratroopers, but rather are the scenes where we witness a member of Easy Company see his friend and brother injured or killed. These men went to war for their country and the whole world, yes, but they fought for the man beside them, fought to protect him because of the brotherly love that they shared. I cannot imagine how much it must have hurt for one of those soldiers to watch as his best friends died. It's incredible that any of them endured such torment and continued to fight. And if they weren't able to continue, who could possibly think less of them because of it? There's so much more that could be said about this incredible show, topics to be touched on such as the leadership of Winters, Compton, Spears, and Lipton, and I could certainly talk for a long time about each individual episode, but I'm going to leave those subjects for future videos. Band of Brothers is, at its core, a show about the ultimate love that one man can have for another, laying down his life for his friends. That is the reason Easy Company was able to keep fighting for months on end, enduring the toughest tests the war could throw at them, surviving multiple changes in leadership and several incompetent officers, and being asked not only to survive, but to win. And win they did, battle after battle from D-Day to the Battle of the Bulge. In his book Band of Brothers, Stephen E. Ambrose writes of Easy Company, at the peak of its effectiveness in Holland in 1944 and in the Ardennes in 1945, it was as good a rifle company as there was in the world.
Well, you're looking at 2 full companies of SS out there. About 50 dead, probably another 100 wounded. That's not bad for Dukeman.
If it was not, I'd hazard a guess that it wouldn't warrant a book and an HBO miniseries. Audiences want to see victors. We want to know what made them so special. In the crucible of Captain Sobel's relentless training, the men of Easy Company were forced to bond together to survive. That closeness, the men were so familiar with each other that they could identify their comrades by the way they walked, stood, or wore their helmets, produced an incredibly effective combat unit, and their success in combat further strengthened the bond between brothers. That bond, the respect and love each man had for his fellow soldiers, is what made this band of brothers truly exceptional. And the series absolutely nailed this theme. We see Easy Company support and encourage each other during training in Toccoa. We note how each soldier trusts that each of his brothers will carry out his assignment at Breakcore Manor on D-Day. We laugh as they crack jokes with one another, as they shiver through the Belgian winter.
That water's nuts, Sarge. Doing fine, Bill. Nice to ask.
We anxiously watch as they guide each other through the tumultuous end of the war and the struggle to get enough points to get sent home. And we sit stunned with them as they witness their best friends broken and bleeding. It could not be more obvious that these men love one another. I feel like I'm belaboring that point, but it really can't be overstated. Easy Company wasn't one of the most effective infantry units of its time because it was comprised of heartless killing automatons, but rather because it was made up of men who loved and respected each other on a deep and profound level, with a strength that few members of the show's audience can truly say they know. That is what makes Band of Brothers a timeless masterpiece. For all its incredible visuals, its excellent writing and acting, what truly defines this show is that it makes us care by showing us brothers who truly cared more about the man next to them than they did for themselves. Let us all aspire to be that kind of friend to those we love.